Hi, everyone, and welcome to Beyond the Journey. We are incredibly grateful for this community that's developed. Let's heal and grow and learn together. And today we are incredibly excited to have Dr. Ron Alexander.
Dr. Ron has an incredible, wide, vast history in the field. He's a licensed psychotherapist, a somatic experiencing practitioner, and is a creativity and communication consultant and an executive leadership coach with a private psychotherapy practice working with individuals, couples, families, and groups in Santa Monica, California. He's the executive director of the Open Mind Training Program, a leading-edge organization that offers personal and professional training programs in core creativity, mind-body therapies, transformational leadership, and mindfulness meditation. For more than 44 years, Alexander has been a trainer of healthcare professionals in North America, as well as in Europe, Russia, Japan, China, and Australia. As a mindfulness and Zen Buddhist practitioner, he specializes in utilizing mindfulness meditation in his professional and corporate work to help people transform their lives by accessing the mind states that open the portal to their core creativity. Welcome, Ron. Thank you for being here.
It's a delight, Stephen Abbey.
Thank you.
Can you let us know a little bit about what brought you to this work?
Well, in 1970, the fall, I was a student at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And I looked out my dorm room and there was a Tai Chi class. And so I decided, and it was just starting to snow, so I decided to go down and join the Tai Chi class. And a guy came up to me at the end of the class and introduced himself as Daniel P. Brown. And he became one of the leading researchers in psychedelic research, along with Dr. Stanislav Grof at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center in Baltimore. And so he asked me if I was interested in taking his class on altered states of consciousness. And so I didn't really know, other than through the Beatles music, growing up as a musician in Boston, that there was meditation and LSD and things like that. But I hadn't participated in that just yet. And so the other thing is he offered to give me a psychedelic experience with classical music, because he was working with Dr. Helen Bonney, who was the founder and director of Institute for Consciousness and Music in Baltimore, Maryland. And she was preparing all of the music tapes for the psychedelic sessions with LSD and psilocybin and MDMA, which was the mother load. No, MDA, which was the mother load as the precursor for MDMA. And so, of course, being 20 years old, I said, well, I'm going to Florida next week for Christmas break. Sure. How about we do it? And so I had an experience, and I was in junior college, I was in the top 5% of my class in business administration. So like my father, who was an executive for 45 years in AT&T, I thought I was going to just become an executive. And so we ingested the LSD, and I had a profound mystical experience, life-altering. And so I came back from Florida and changed from business administration to psychology, Buddhist studies at Smith College, and consciousness studies at Hampshire College, because at that time in history, there was a 5-college program. And so then the other college that I went to was Amherst College. And there was a professor named Robert Thurman, who was a young professor, and he had 2 little kids. One of them's name was Uma, and she was about 1 or 2 years old. And we used to play at their house. And so he, along with Dr. Brown, were some of the very early pioneers in the psychedelic field. And Thurman, Dr. Thurman, was coming back. He was ordained as one of the first Western Tibetan monks by the Dalai Lama. And so he'd been in India and studying in Tibet for many years. And he comes home and he's at the Heathrow Airport. And standing behind him is his wife-to-be Uma, who had been hanging out with Dr. Timothy Leary when he was in Europe and on the lam from the federal government. And so we had this whole psychedelic soiree in Amherst. And so we would invite Dr. Stanislav Grof, Dr. Stanley Krippner, Dr. Stuart Twemlow from the Meninga Foundation, and Dr. Jean Houston, who was also a psychedelic researcher, and her husband, Robert Masters, to Amherst to give talks, along with Alan Watts, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and many others. And so there was this cross between an interest in consciousness studies, hypnosis, somatic body therapy, meditation, and coupled with an interest in exploring MDA, psilocybin, and LSD. And so there was a core group of us who were young interns at the the Room to Move, which was a student-run drop-in center at the university. And so we were being trained and supervised to be specialists in helping students who were having bad trips. They would come into our center, guide them through it.
Wow. What a beginning.
Yeah.
Wow. You've written extensively about creativity. What is the difference between creativity as we usually think of it and your ideas of core creativity? And how do you feel that that brings a more creative, better life?
Ordinary creativity usually is a compilation of when people add to something that already exists or has already been channeled through. And core creativity is very unique in that it's a portal of internal receptivity where you open up the nervous system and the collective unconscious to have a direct experience of bringing in something that's fresh, original, and unique. So for case in point, when you think of the early Beatles albums, they were creative. But when they went into Rubber Soul and Sgt. Pepper's and the White Album, there's a paradigm shift because they were at that time in history experimenting with LSD in London. And you see that they moved from being a very creative band into a core creative band where sounds are coming through and arrangements that are completely coming from a very unique internal place. So core creativity at its best is about accessing the parts of your creative unconscious directly and then bringing that forward into the world. So in my book, Core Creativity, I talk about 3 stages. The first stage is about receptivity and immersing oneself in all sorts of art, literature, music, poetry, painting, to immerse yourself, to steep yourself. Then the second access state of core creativity is open mind. And that's a term that I coined. I happened to, in 1993, have the unique opportunity to be on the tail end of the U2 Europa tour with the band in Ireland. So at 2:30 in the morning, I get a call, and it's The Edge, the lead guitarist, and his wife, Morley, and they say, "Oh, Dr. Ron, we're down here in the pub. It's 2:30. I'd already gone to bed after the concert. We're having Guinnesses. Would you like to come down? We'd like to talk to you about the relationship between dreams and creativity." And so I had just been at Mozart's house in Vienna at the museum, and I was going through with a fine magnifying glass his own personal writings. And I saw a line where he said, one must open themselves up in order to enter into open mind.
Mm.
Oh my God, that's exactly what I've been thinking about and what I've been wanting to write about is open mind consciousness. So my first book was Wise Mind and Open Mind. And anyways, I cite that case example of us sitting around and talking about creativity. And the Edge said to me, well, for the last 3 to 6 months, whether I'm doing yoga or I'm out on my deck or I'm driving in my car, I'm hearing music.
Mm.
And where does that come from? And of course, I sat right up and said, that's open-minded consciousness. And then I told him the story about Mozart, and we, all laughed and embraced that open mind is the access to the creative unconscious. And Carl Jung, the famous Swiss psychiatrist, who wrote extensively about the personal unconscious, the collective unconscious, the racial unconscious, and the universal unconscious, also wrote that the direct portal to accessing creativity is an inner one first, after there is immersion out in the world. And then the third point on core creativity is after you immerse yourself, step one, you open into open mind and you access the direct portal to creativity, is then you have to, what I call, move into activating mind. And activating mind is how do you take an image, a color, a feeling, a motif, an archetype, and how do you bring it into the real world and activate?
And into your daily life.
Into your daily life. And in the book called Creativity, I even talk about how mothers, when they're getting their kids ready for school, can be creative at it. So that you don't have to just be a musician or a painter or an artist. Everything that we do. So, for example, every time I sit with a patient, every time I take 1 or 2 minutes, I close my eyes and I ask to just receive from the inside, slow everything down. And oftentimes I'll actually do it with the patient for like 3 to 5 minutes and actually say, would you like to take some time and use mindfulness, which is a meditative portal into the inner self, so that you can become more receptive and we can receive together what your unconscious is bubbling up and what my unconscious is bubbling up about the mind-body healing work that we need to do today and spiritual work.
That's fantastic.
So beautiful.
You mentioned your work with Dr. Helen Bonney and also your work at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center with Doctors Stan Groff, Joan Halifax, and Bill Richards. What did you learn about how psychedelics foster and promote profound creativity, and how did it inform your thinking about creativity?
There were 3 or 4 different projects going on between 1970 and 76 at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. One was the LSD study that was studying patients who had terminal illnesses. The second study was using LSD and psilocybin to explore people that were psychotic, schizophrenic, and gravely disabled. Then the third study, which really fascinated me, not that the first 2 didn't, but the one that really captivated me was they were doing LSD research with pastors, ministers, nuns, and musicians and painters and artists and poets. And so I got to directly observe many, many sessions that Dr. Groff, really next to Albert Hoffman, is really the grandfather of the core of all psychedelic research. And in those sessions that I observed, I witnessed and heard people describing extraordinary access into their inner selves. And musicians saying that they were hearing music, lyrics were coming to them, painters were talking about that when they came through the session, paintings or collages that they wanted to make. And so I was really, really impressed that how a psychedelic drug could take one from ordinary creativity, like a nuclear rocket them into an entirely different realm, fast forward to those studies in those years in Maryland, is I arrive in Hollywood, Los Angeles, in 1974, and I do a series of internships, and one led me to working with musicians and filmmakers, people involved in television writing, and then later, people that became part of the architects of the dot-com business. So like Sun Microsystems and Apple. So I did consulting for them on creativity, Universal, Sony, Paramount, and on and on and on. And I was fascinated that when they would come in and they would say that they were going to do what was referred to in those days and is currently referred to plant medicine, psychedelic substances as psychedelic medicine. And how after a weekend journey on LSD or psilocybin or MDA, they would come in and the musicians would especially say to me, I'm just writing in a way that I've never written in my life. And so that's that open mind portal that psychedelics invite you to access, so that what happens that I discovered is one has to get the ordinary ego mind to move into a temporary state under a psychedelic experience of what we call ego dissolution. And there was a noted psychological theorist called Dubrava, and he wrote a book called Positive Disintegration.
What a good term.
And he was someone that also participated in LSD research in the early years, like in the 50s or 60s. So that individuals who oftentimes we're blocked or we're stuck in the ordinary waking state, and let's call that channel 2. And we tend to think that channel 2 is the only channel when after you have a psychedelic experience, you discover there's 500 channels. And many or more, that's right, Abby. And more importantly, that when you take a psychedelic experience, it moves you very quickly out of channel 2. So you're no longer in ego mind. And with dosage, when you move up beyond a middle level dose to a high level, heroic dose, there's a rocketing effect. But the rocketing is inward. Most people describe it, well, I went out of my mind. Well, what they're really talking about is they went in through the ego mind, that became temporarily dissolved, and then they experienced the greater all mind. And psychedelics take us to the numinosity, the oneness, the ineffable sense that we are not only one cell in this divine body, but as one cell in this divine body, we are interconnected with all of the cells in the divine body. And there's all these creativity cells that are flowing constantly. And ego mind is only what's keeping us from accessing the core creativity of the universal mind.
Yeah, it's great.
So beautiful. And we're going to go back later because sometimes those dissolution experiences can be very frightening for people.
Yes.
How you just described is like, yes, I want that, right? So I'm going to ask about that in a minute. I want to go back for a second. You said that you ended up doing the LSD with clergy and artists. What was the reaction from clergy? What did they find?
What was fascinating is that many of the clergy, who at that time in history was primarily Protestant ministers, Catholic priests, and Catholic Christian nuns, is how, with that core basis connected to Christianity and Catholicism, during the psychedelic experiences, they would say, not only am I one with Jesus the Christ, But Jesus the Christ is at one with all of the Christ consciousness, which is at one with all consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they would come out and we would do integration sessions, they would talk about how they experienced their heart opening up to all religions of the world,
Mm-hmm.
and that they categorically, in unity, had an experience of numinosity, that religion was a step towards the divine, but numinosity was the experience psychedelically of the entire divine. And that would profoundly shift them. And many of the people that we spoke to in follow-up studies started studying Zen Buddhism. I can't name anybody, but there was a very well-known Catholic priest who ended up becoming a Zen Roshi. And for decades was a Catholic priest, and he was teaching as a Zen master. And that's one example of someone who had a complete
Yeah.
spiritual epiphany, profound transformation, and then was able to broaden off the base of the Christian Catholic belief and enter into a study of Eastern spirituality, which, interestingly enough, and I mentioned about that in my first book, I write about it in Wise Mind, Open Mind, is Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk from the monastery in Yosemite, had a variety of psychedelic experiences. And then he spent the last 2 years of his life becoming friends and visiting the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala. And he said once to the Dalai Lama, "What's the difference? You wear an orange robe, I wear a brown robe." And then they both laughed and they both said, "But outside the robes, we are just one."
Mm-hmm.
And they hugged.
Oh, beautiful.
So, yeah, there's an example of the guy that wrote The Wisdom of the Desert, where he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights like Jesus. And then he had this profound experience earlier in his life of the Christ consciousness. And then with psychedelic experience, it went from the Christ consciousness to universal consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And then became interested in what we call in Buddhist psychology co-independent origination, which is the interconnection of all things. And again, going back to the cells of creativity that flow in our own separate selves from the codependent origination place. As we tap into the cells of creativity internally, we absolutely have the opportunity, especially on the psychedelic, to then merge with all of the creativity. And in my own experience, I've had times where, I mean, in the last 5 years, when I was working on the most recent book, I was downloading in the psychedelic session one chapter. I was like, it was like page after page coming off a printer. And then there was another part of me that was watching all this and laughing. Cosmically, I became aware, because the part watching was the witnessing mind. And then what I was witnessing was the universal core creative mind, that all that information is out there. I just happened to be tapping into it in that psychedelic session. And when I got up, as part of my integration, is I wrote that whole entire chapter, beginning to end.
Cool.
What a story.
Yeah, because in creativity thinking, you can have a thought or a musical lyric, or the feeling of a musical rhythm, or the concept of a painting, because you're tapping into that universal field. And someone else in Switzerland or in Australia can be having it absolutely the same time, because it's in the field. What makes the difference is that third stage of core creativity I talk about, which is activating mind, is you grab it. You take the opportunity to get your limited ego mind and you put it to the side in a basket, or drag it to the desktop of your mind. Then you go inside. And with the psychedelic, as you know, when you take a psychedelic and you go inside with the intention of accessing core creativity, you link right in to what's already ever present, ongoing, pristine, pure, and dynamically original at a core creative level. It's already there. So whether you're the Beatles or you're Ron or you're Joseph Campbell, it's the tapping in that's most important. Joe Campbell, I met him when I was 22. He came to Amherst and we brought him to an ashram to have dinner. And I remember turning and starting to talk to him, and he said, "So, Sonny, you look of the ripe age of psychedelic voyage. Tell me about your trips." And so I was telling him about my trips. He said, "Well, I tell Gene that when I'm writing in a condo in Honolulu and I'm looking out over the ocean, that I have this experience that all of this information is coming to me just like one wave after another after another." And he goes, "Sonny, I think when you're experiencing those psychedelics, think about the waves."
Oh,
What a
I
great
love
story,
this.
Ron.
I love
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
Okay, everything that you've said is about daily life and also about preparation and integration. So, one piece is that you've spoken about the need for careful preparation,
Yes.
psychedelic work. What are some of the most important ingredients of careful preparation, and how do people utilize intent, set and setting, and support to cultivate a positive experience?
Okay. The number one thing that I counsel all of my patients, and especially those that are in their 20s, the young musicians. For some reason, I have a lot of young lead guitarists, and they microdose and they take
Started way back.
and they take ayahuasca on weekends, and they're cosmonauts, I call them. The number one thing is assessment. And as clinicians, we all know that it's important to assess family genetic history and to go back and to create a primary family history scenario. Uncles, aunts, mom, dad, grandfather, grandmother on both sides to assess for us the inequality of mental illness, especially psychotic, schizophrenic, schizoaffective. Why? Because those of us who came up in the 70s and 80s utilizing psychedelics discovered that certain percent of the population who have mental illness at an endogenous and genetic level can have a negative predisposition to unlocking the gene of schizophrenia, as well as bipolar disorder. So assessment's important. And then I will never tell someone, don't do it. But anyone that I work with who has those kinds of negative genetic loadings, where there was an uncle who became psychotic and he took magic mushrooms and then became schizophrenic and is in a hospital in Massachusetts, is I caution people to err on the side of, why don't you start first with something like MDMA and see how you experience that. And then if that's positive and you still want to go further, why don't you start with what we call a very mild psychedelic dose of psilocybin? And then people who have someone that committed suicide or became schizophrenic at age 20 because they took LSD, I oftentimes say, I think that's one you might want to leave in the file and fast forward to, why don't you explore ayahuasca or ibogaine or 5-MeO-DMT. Let's leave LSD to the side because there's something about the nuclear quality of psychedelic substance in LSD that doesn't work well with people with those forms of serious mental illness. That aside, for the rest of the population, intention. What is your intention? What's your psychological intention? Like, why do you want to do this? What's your spiritual intention? What would you like to experience spiritually or mystically? So clarifying and finally attuning to psychological to emotional, like what's your intention for healing? What do you want to heal in the mind? What do you want to heal in your body? And then lastly, your spiritual intention. Where are you? Do you have a spiritual path? Do you meditate? Do you do yoga? Do you play tennis? Do you ski? Do you run? Is there something that you do where there's meditation in action? And the last three things I just mentioned, those are all forms of, tennis, skiing, running, surfing. Those are meditations, mindful meditations in activity. And Steve, I know you know about tennis that
A
it
long
takes
time ago.
all right, but heightened concentration. If I remember in the early days, you used to share in class that you really have to actually even focus on the ball itself.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I love that you're saying this because there's so many forms of meditation. I think a lot of people don't realize that activities that they're doing
Yeah.
That's right.
are part of a meditative spiritual practice.
That's right.
And then it can be a part with attunement of preparation.
Yeah. So then from intention comes the two principles that Larry Alpert and Metzner, who wrote or rewrote the Tibetan Book of the Dead as a psychedelic manual when they were at Harvard. And that's where mindset, what you set your mind on, and how you utilize the mind. And that's where classical music, headphones, and blindfolds come in. So there's three portals that I suggest people explore that are best utilizing set and setting. Setting is one of the three. And that's number one is always participate in a psychedelic experience where you can be indoors for a while and then you can go out into nature. Two is to use classical music and or new age music or sitar music so that it activates the senses of hearing. And then three, have a blindfold, which takes you into the inner domain. So you start out in the ordinary waking state, psychedelic medicine comes on, spend a certain amount of time experiencing what it's like to go through what I call the liftoff. And then add the music in the blindfold, lay down, and with the assistance of a trained guide, go into the third domain, which is the inner portal. And if you're interested in creativity, the inner portal, that's your mother lode.
That's the access.
Yeah, that's the access tube. You're just going to go right into that tube and get shot outward, which is really inward to outward. And so intention, setting. And then the fourth principle is one that the two of you have been talking about, is integration. The importance that you spend time integrating the psychedelic experience on all realms, on the spiritual realm, the psychological, the mental, the feeling realm, and then the mystical realm. Because oftentimes we can journey in any one psychedelic experience between all those five realms and kind of come in and come out. Sometimes we're clearing out pain and suffering from our childhood or the past. And other times we're in the visitation of that divinity, of the universal oneness for hours and hours and hours, just floating around. And then other times there's the experience of what I had once, where a colleague friend that we all know and I had together one day where we were going through past lives over and over and over. And then we went all the way back to like a circle from the here and now to the very last past life, all the potential future lives. And just before we got back to the here and now, we had this experience that somebody died in an accident. And later on, like 4 or 5 years later, our friendship died. And so you see, we were having an experience in the future of something that had yet to come that didn't have any form other than an accident. So psychedelics can very profoundly pinpoint, and they have a prescience to them of predictions of things that you can experience in the future as well as the past.
Because of the differences in terms of time, what time is.
Yeah. Time on a psychedelic, there's time, place, and space. And there's linear time, like horizontal, and then there's vertical time. And if you take those two lines and draw a circle around them, but with little etched points, you pop out of that circle eventually. And you pop into time itself, not linear or horizontal time, meaning not the past nor the future, simply that in every moment of the now is infinity. And so in each and every now, there's an infinity, like the figure 8, and in every now, there's a here, and a here, and a here.
That's beautiful. Ron, you shared with us that there was a time in the early 80s when you were struggling with depression and suffered a very difficult series of losses. How did psychedelics play a role in helping you through that and reopening you to your roots in mysticism and meditation and yoga? And in particularly, how did you integrate what you experienced in those creative states into your life to help you through that?
Towards the late 70s and the early 80s, I got divorced. I was studying with a guru, and we found out the guru was really a charlatan, although he had interesting and scientific teachings of Kundalini yoga, he was a sociopathic sexual deviant. And then I had found my dream house in Laurel Canyon, and it fell down the hillside. So like I had all these losses. And then I was in psychoanalysis 3 days a week with somebody who completely didn't understand any of my interest in spirituality. And at that time, I was teaching courses on Zen at UCLA in both the medical school and in extension. And he used to refer to me as, "Oh, Dr. Ron Alexander, you're somewhat unorthodox, aren't you, in these things?" Now, ironically, this same very esteemed psychoanalyst, 40 years later, participated in another textbook where he was doing commentary on mindfulness and Zen meditation for some New York psychiatrists. Something that I was really part of the very, very first wave, bringing mindfulness in the 70s to UCLA. It wasn't until 2008 that UCLA Extension, under my deceased late friend, Dr. Marian Solomon, she brought the mindfulness conferences and the neurobiological conferences with Dan Siegel to UCLA. So coming out of that period, I would say I was extremely depressed. And psychoanalysis, I was getting more and more depressed. And I seriously was like, life is so bad. Maybe I should just swim out into the ocean and let nature do its course. That's how severe I had gotten in my mind. And so then a colleague and friend of mine said, why don't we do some MDMA sessions? And at that point, it was legal. And so I had an MDMA experience, and I actually saw, even though it's a body psychedelic from the neck down, it's not a authentic, it's an ethnogen as opposed to a true psychedelic. But for me, because of all my years of meditating and my times in India and doing yoga, I had the full experience. It didn't stop at my neck. I went right up, and I saw in the middle of this experience is this voice came in, and it said, "Now breathe. And remember, when you're breathing and you're doing yoga and you're meditating, this is what happens with the neurotransmitter. And then it said, now focus on what your neurotransmitters look like as you're feeling sad and depressed. And I could actually see they were like shut down, they were congested, and there was very little light in them. And then I went into, okay, now shuttle. You're going to shift now from your left prefrontal cortex to your right and watch what happens. And I had this experience with my entire right prefrontal cortex lit right up. I mean, think of the strongest light bulb that you have in your driveway. It just lit up my whole right prefrontal cortex. And again, internally, and I saw the difference. And then I opened my eyes and I said to the shamans that were guiding me, I said, I just saw my brain and I don't need to be depressed anymore. I know how to shift it from left brain to right. And so I did a left-right brain shift. And then 20 years later, Dr. Richard Davison at the Keck Lab at the University of Madison in Wisconsin, he actually did, using MRI studies, studying the left-right prefrontal shift that occurs. And so
what was that? Go ahead.
I have a follow-up question. So you had that epiphany, that moment, that vision.
Yeah.
Afterwards, I mean, you named how the medicine or how that vision told you that it was during yoga and during those meditative processes.
Yes.
Just to name a bit of integration after the experience, what's an example of a moment where you did that, where you weren't in the medicine, but you were integrating it in this human realm?
So, good question, Abby. So I immediately left the psychoanalyst and the psychoanalytic therapy that I was in Monday morning. I went in and said, I'm done. We don't speak the same language. And then I started my second analysis with a wonderful woman named Dr. Estelle Shane, Institute of Contemporary Psychoanalysis. And she took great meticulous attention. She said, I've never experienced what you've experienced, but I'm going to stay open to helping you to integrate what you experienced. So she was helping me to integrate what my nervous system had gone through. And then she did a very psychoanalytically insightful thing. She said, and in the rest of the session, was there any emotion or feeling or bodily sensations or memories that came up? And I completely forgot that I'd gone into all this profound grief and crying and sobbing. And I visited the early childhood trauma that I experienced of having been at the hands of a very violent and abusive father. And that all washed through me. And so then she took a lot of time. We took many, many sessions, maybe even a year or 2 years of sessions of working through the trauma that bubbled up and became crystal clear. Oh, that's underneath the divorce. Oh, that's underneath why I studied with a guru. Oh, that's underneath why I chose to pick that house. And so we took a lot of time in an analytic setting to piece together the mystical and the psychotherapeutic.
Ron, one of your strengths seems to be this seamless blending of very complex ideas from Eastern and Western psychological approaches to mind and body. What are some of the other more important ideas in those areas that can be utilized in integrating the value from both profound but also difficult journey experiences?
Okay. Well, again, like assessment, is to make sure that you do a lot of thorough follow-up, so that if somebody had any part of a psychedelic journey where pieces of material bubbled up, that you take plenty of time and attention, whether you're a guide or you're a therapist or you're a coach or you're a shaman, to help that person to amplify and to work through and to get the time, attention, and the therapeutic mind-body healing therapeutic pathway that a person needs. And each person needs different mind-body therapy healing pathways. No one shoe fits all.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing. The other thing is to understand something that was very nicely articulated by the transpersonal psychologist and most preeminent transpersonal theorist in the world, Dr. Ken Wilber.
Mm-hmm.
And he's articulated that to truly understand and assist someone in real solid integration, you have to understand stage and state.
Mm-hmm.
State is when people who are exploring psychedelic experience, they have the blast off in the ineffable or the oneness experience, and they come down, and then they want to keep ingesting and going back up because we all know there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of pain and suffering in the here and now. So the state explorers need a lot of assistance from the other side of what Ken Wilber articulated as the stage explorers. And the stage explorers are guys like me and Dan Brown and all sorts of folks who understand the necessity of it's not about just going up and coming down,
Mm-hmm.
but it's about psychotherapeutically, just as we have developmental psychology, and oftentimes we have to go back into the past to developmentally repair
Mm-hmm.
gaps or deficits in childhood experience or trauma. And there's also in somatic experiencing language, the distinction between developmental trauma and shock trauma,
Mm-hmm.
where people have been beaten or, incested or burned or scalded, etc. And that the stage approach, uniquely Eastern spiritual, psychedelic, mystical traditions with Western psychotherapeutic healing traditions. And it doesn't have to be limited either to just Western psychotherapy. It can be shamanic disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
People that, for example, do hypnosis are oftentimes trained to help somebody integrate a psychedelic experience that they've had. So the importance is the bridging the gap between the state people who are just trying to metaphorically keep getting high to get higher.
Great
Mm-hmm.
distinction.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, great.
The integration between what kind of repair or mind-body healing needs to occur and what you experience from both the state approach and the stage approach, and to bring them developmentally together so that I'm constantly, if you will, taking a thread and putting it through the needle and then stitching together each of these two paradigms to bring them to be one rather than just an internal state, altered states of consciousness exploration versus a psychotherapeutic and developmental stage approach. And that the dynamic interplay between the two is the real jewel. And I consider it's the laser tool that when we're helping people to integrate their experiences, is that we're able to shuttle with them between each of these very vast and highly complex domains of human potential and ordinary and extraordinary states of consciousness.
So you just put unbelievable words to this very complex, layered process of going through or the process of integration. We also know that right now in this renaissance of this work, some people are going to work with therapists. Some people are going to work with facilitators of different kinds. You named several. Some people are going to do it on their own or do it with friends. And so one of the things for this Beyond the Summit, Beyond the Journey Summit, is that I want people to be able to walk away with a toolkit. And so can you give something that would be something that could actually be utilized, or an example that you did with somebody or that you did on your own, or one exercise that somebody could take and do?
All right, I'll give two.
Great.
Great.
I'll be brief. One's from somatic experiencing, and the architect is Dr. Peter Levine, and it's especially helpful, not only in ordinary therapy when somebody is in crisis. It's called the emergency. It's one of many emergency toolkits, and it's especially useful. I found that when someone comes into my home office and perhaps has, unbeknownst to me, has undertaken some sort of psychedelic drug, and they show up to the session and they're in some kind of state of crisis, is I ask them to put their right hand under their left armpit, left hand under the right armpit, and then to breathe in through the nose and hold the breath for 3, and then breathe out long, slow, and deep. 6, emptying the lungs, emptying the abdomen, and then to breathe in again. 3 on the in-breath, you hold for 3, and then on the out-breath through the mouth, 6. And you pucker the lips. Now, in somatic experiencing, we find this particularly helpful when people are in crisis and or they're in a spiritual emergency, not on a psychedelic. But I have found it very helpful when someone's having what we call an untoward, in common talk, a bad trip.
Yeah.
I don't like to use the term bad, because if a skilled facilitator knows how to work with that, anything bad is usually connected to constriction and restriction of usually emotion, feeling, or memory. And if you can hold the person, get them to do the spiritual exercise physiologically, it takes the nervous system out of fight or flight and turns on from the central nervous system, the sympathetic, to the parasympathetic. And it loosens up a little bit of the dorsal brake on the parasympathetic side. The second is more of a yogic therapy exercise that I discovered is really, really useful when someone's starting to go into difficult territory. It's either laying down, or I'll ask them to actually sit up, still with the blindfold on, and take the thumb and the first fingers together. And in yoga therapy, we call this Gyan Mudra. And there's something about communication, the thumb and the first finger. And I'll ask them to visualize that as they breathe in, they're breathing in energy from the Divine Mother. And as they breathe out, they're releasing any pain, any trauma, any suffering, any dis-ease or illness. And so I'll ask them to do that for 4 or 5 minutes, and usually it will just move somebody right out of the difficulty and into a much more balanced state of equanimity and or connection and attunement with the heart chakra. Because you want to hold the arms up at this, can you see me this
Yes,
side?
Kind of.
I think so.
Yes.
Yeah. And ask them that when they're breathing, to breathe in, receiving energy from the universal mother into the heart chakra, and then breathing out tension, suffering, dis-ease. So those are 2 good ones.
Those are 2 really good ones.
Practical tools.
In the moments, and in the moments in the journey, and in the moments beyond the journey.
That's right.
Really
That's
like.
right. That's
We
right.
could all just start the day like this.
No, when I'm driving downtown from Topanga and I'm in bumper to bumper on the 10, I go right into it. And then sometimes I do this, just sitting in the car. And then it moves from, oh, I'm going to be late. Oh my God. To, so, okay. Yeah, I'm exactly where I need to be at this moment in time. So into a place of acceptance. But those two exercises, amongst many, many other that I have in
Yes.
somatic
Oh, good.
experience, yes,
This is great, Ron.
yeah.
This has been fantastic, and you've given so much wonderful information. Is there anything that you think we left out or you want to add before we wrap this up?
And I have one question about your gift that you're giving.
Okay. Yes. My first book is about mindfulness meditation in Buddhist psychology and creativity thinking. There's an old saying where somebody asks Yehudi Mendon,
Mhm.
meets him on 57th at 57th Street in Manhattan, doesn't know who he is, and says, "How do you get to Carnegie Hall?" And Mendon turns to him and says, "Practice, practice, practice." So I would suggest that people find a meditation form. Mine happens to be mindfulness, rooted in the Buddhist tradition. But I've also extensively studied transcendental meditation and probably 10 other systems of meditation, is to find some form of daily quieting where you become receptive and you can do it out in nature, or you can do it inside on a chair or a cushion, to take 3 to 20 minutes once or twice a day and to go inside and to receive. And I think it's also a very effective tool to assist in integration, is that people who don't have a spiritual discipline after they have psychedelic journeys oftentimes really are hungry and they're looking for something, so that guides and practitioners can provide spiritual pathways, but then continuing that stage model.
Mhm.
And the PDF I'm offering is chapter 33 that Dr. Elisha Goldstein and I co-wrote for the Harvard University textbook called Mindfulness and Psychotherapy, Volume 1 and Volume 2. And it's chapter 33 called Mindfulness, Trauma, and Trance, New Integrations in Buddhist Psychology and Mind-Body Healing.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Ron.
Can't thank you enough, Ron. This is fantastic.
Yeah, this is fun.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you very much.
All right. Goodbye, everybody. Thank
Bye.
you.